They say Charleston still remembers that morning, not in history books, not in museums, but in the whispers that curl through the alleys when the fog comes in from the Ashley River. March 15th, 1847. The air was heavy, metallic, like the breath of a dying world. Inside the grand dining room of the Whitmore plantation, 3 bodies sat slumped over their breakfast plates, their eyes wide open, their mouths frozen mid-breath. Silverware still gleamed under the morning light, catching the faint shimmer of the oleander's kiss. Outside, cicadas hummed like mourners. Inside, a single woman moved silently, her every step deliberate, her gaze distant. Her name was Hannah Morrison, a slave cook who just rewrote the balance of power in the South with a handful of leaves and centuries of quiet rage. No one spoke of what happened in that house. The coroner blamed the food, the family priest blamed the devil, and the Charleston Courier called it a tragedy of mysterious origin. But in the quarters, behind locked doors and whispered prayers, they said something else. They said justice had finally found its way into a cup of coffee. They said the ghosts of the lash had chosen their instrument, a woman no one saw coming. And they said, with trembling awe, that the walls of the South had cracked that day, even if no one above ground heard the sound. You see, history loves its heroes, neat and clean soldiers, preachers, men in marble. But the real architects of change often come from the fire beneath. Hannah was not born free, nor educated, nor permitted to dream. But she understood something most men never do, that knowledge, once weaponized, is more powerful than any whip or gun. And her story, the real one, the forbidden one, was buried on purpose. Because if you knew what she did, and why, you'd start questioning the very foundations of what you've been told is civilization. So tonight, as the lights flicker and your screen glows against the dark, understand this. You are not just hearing a story. You are entering a secret. Once you step in, you can't go back. Charleston, 1840s, the city of charm, they called it, the city of steeples, where church bells rang over cobblestone streets and gentlemen tipped their hats to passing ladies. But beneath the perfume and polished silver, the city had a heartbeat made of chains. Every mansion stood on bones. Every prayer that rose from its chapels floated on the smoke of human suffering. The same hands that carved the woodwork of Whitmore Hall had been whipped raw in the fields just beyond the river. Every candle that lit the dinner table was paid for with blood. Charleston wasn't a city. It was a theater, a grand illusion designed to convince the powerful that cruelty was order and submission was divine. And Hannah, born into its kitchen shadows, saw everything. She saw the hypocrisy of men who knelt at church on Sunday morning and ordered lashings by noon. She saw her master's guests laugh about mercy while sipping imported wine. She watched her mother bow her head so low it almost touched the dirt, not out of respect, but survival. And in the glow of those kitchen fires, Hannah learned the oldest law of all, that control begins in the mind. Before they chain your wrists, they chain your thoughts. Every command, every hymn, every whispered rule was part of a design to convince the enslaved that obedience was holy and resistance was sin. But Hannah had inherited something dangerous from her mother, awareness. And awareness, in a system built on lies, is poison. It spreads quietly, it burns slowly, and when it reaches the heart, nothing can remain the same. At night, when the household slept, she'd sit by the dying embers and listen to the voices outside. The whispers of men in the fields, the moans from the quarters, the rhythm of drums in the distance, old rhythms, forbidden ones from across the ocean. They carried stories that no whip could erase, stories of kingdoms before captivity, gods before chains, and as Hannah listened, something ancient stirred within her, a knowing, a memory that she didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Because deep inside, she began to realize this world wasn't just cruel. It was engineered that way, designed to keep her blind, but she was beginning to see. The plantation kitchen was more than heat and hunger. It was the one place a slave could touch every part of her master's life, his food, his drink, his breath. And Hannah began to understand that power didn't always wear a whip or a badge. Sometimes it hid behind a wooden spoon. Her mother, Celia, had always told her that a cook sees what no one else sees. It was true. From the kitchen window, Hannah saw the full choreography of the plantation, the overseer's patrols, the merchants' arrivals, the servants' routines. But more importantly, she saw the habits of the family she served. She learned when they ate, when they argued, when they slept. Knowledge was her first weapon. Patience was her second. By the time she turned 17, she could identify nearly every plant that grew within 10 miles of the Ashley River. What others saw as wildflowers or weeds, Hannah saw as tools, instruments of balance in a world that had forgotten justice. Oleander, foxglove, belladonna, each beautiful, each deadly, each whispering a promise to those who knew how to listen. She began to keep small bundles of dried leaves hidden beneath the floorboards of the smokehouse. No one noticed. Why would they? To the white eyes that watched her, she was invisible, a shadow moving between chores, a servant too simple to matter. They didn't see her mind working. They never imagined that beneath her quiet obedience, calculations were unfolding like vines beneath the soil. Every day, she tested small amounts on animals, first rats, then chickens. She took notes in her memory since paper was forbidden. She observed the timing, the symptoms, the color of death. But what she sought wasn't chaos. It was precision, control, the ability to end suffering without detection, to erase cruelty with a silent hand. Late at night, Celia would notice her daughter staring into the fire, unmoving. "You thinking too hard, child," she'd whisper. "Thinking gets folk in trouble." Hannah's reply was always the same. "No, Mama. Thinking gets folk free." It was during one of these nights that she had a vision, or maybe it was just exhaustion. In the glow of the firelight, she saw the reflection of the plantation's great house flickering inside her pupils. It looked like it was burning. She blinked, and the vision disappeared, but something inside her had shifted forever. From that moment, Hannah stopped dreaming of escape. She began dreaming of ending the system itself, not by running, but by rotting it from within. He came on a Sunday morning just after the storm. A traveling preacher, clothes soaked from the rain, hat in hand, eyes too calm for a man who'd walked 20 miles of flooded dirt road. His name, he said, was Reverend Josiah Cole. To the masters, he was just another colored preacher allowed to sermonize to the slaves about obedience and patience. To the slaves, he was something else entirely. When he spoke, the words sounded holy, but their meaning wasn't. "The Lord will deliver his children." He'd thunder from the porch of the quarters, but he may use strange instruments to do it. Every slave nodded in silence, but every thinking soul in that crowd knew what he meant. Deliverance wasn't always divine. Sometimes it wore a human face. Hannah felt drawn to him not by faith, but by recognition. She saw in his eyes the same cold fire she felt in herself. When the service ended, she approached him with a bowl of water and a quiet question. "Reverend," she asked, "does the Lord forgive them for what they do?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Child," he said, voice low, "forgiveness is for the free. You and I, we got work to do before we can afford such luxuries." That night, after the White family slept, Josiah met a small circle of trusted slaves behind the old smokehouse. There were whispers of rebellion, of secret networks running from Charleston up to Savannah, of coded hymns that carried messages across plantations. But what fascinated Hannah most wasn't the talk of escape, it was the preacher's philosophy. He said power wasn't about chains or guns. Power was belief, the kind that made one man think he was born to rule and another think he was born to serve. If you can touch a man's food, he told her quietly, you can touch his fear, and if you can touch his fear, you own him. Those words stayed with Hannah. She realized she didn't have to strike first. She just had to make them doubt their safety, their food, their control. A whisper of sickness in one house could ripple through an entire county like wildfire. Fear, she understood, was the true contagion. Before dawn, the preacher slipped away, leaving nothing behind but muddy footprints and an unease that lingered long after. But for Hannah, he left something greater, a mission. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She was a keeper of sacred knowledge, a weapon forged in silence. And as the morning sun rose over the plantation, the smoke from the kitchen chimney curled into the sky like a signal, the beginning of something that could no longer be undone. It started small, a missing jar of sugar, a loaf of bread that spoiled overnight, a servant who woke coughing blood and swore she hadn't eaten anything unusual. None of it pointed toward Hannah, and none of it seemed connected. But in the Whitmore household, the air began to change. Thomas Whitmore, the master, started locking the pantry every night. His wife insisted their food be tasted by others before she ate. The overseer, a man named Briggs, began punishing slaves for mistakes they didn't commit. Fear, invisible and untraceable, had entered the house, and Hannah was its architect. She learned to time her acts like a composer writes music. A wrong spice in a meal one week, a rotting carcass buried near the well the next. A servant whispering that the master's shadow looked shorter than before a bad omen, they said. The plantation ran on superstition as much as on blood. Hannah understood this. She used it. Late one night, she overheard Mrs. Whitmore crying in her room, "The house feels cursed." The woman sobbed. "It's as if the walls are listening." Hannah, standing in the dark hall, smiled faintly. The walls were listening, and she was their echo. By now, the preacher's words had rooted deep in her mind. If you can touch a man's fear, you own him. She didn't need to kill, not yet. Fear was more efficient. Fear made men destroy themselves. Briggs began drinking more heavily, beating the field hands to prove control he no longer felt. Thomas Whitmore argued with his wife, convinced the servants were conspiring. Their son, James, stopped sleeping in the main house altogether. The once grand plantation had turned into a theater of paranoia, and Hannah was directing every act. She began keeping a small notebook made from scraps of paper she found in the kitchen. Each night, by candlelight, she wrote not in sentences, but in symbols, marks only she could understand. Circles for the dead, lines for the guilty, crosses for those yet to fall. It was her private scripture, her ledger of vengeance. Then one morning, as Hannah stood by the river washing the breakfast dishes, she noticed something strange. The sky was clear, but the water ran dark, tinted red from the clay upriver. The reflection looked like blood. To her it felt like a sign that nature itself was watching, waiting, ready. From that day forward, she stopped seeing herself as a victim of fate. She became its executor. The plantation was no longer a place of servitude, it was her experiment, her quiet war. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she felt the tremor of a question she could never silence. Once you begin this kind of war, who do you become when it's over? The night it happened, the air was thick with heat, the kind that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. Cicadas screamed from the trees, dogs barked at shadows, and the moon hung low over the Whitmore plantation like a watchful eye. Hannah had planned it for months, every move, every breath. She wasn't angry anymore, anger burned too bright. What filled her now was colder, cleaner, purpose. It began when the overseer, Briggs, whipped a pregnant slave until she miscarried. His laughter echoed through the courtyard, and something in Hannah finally hardened beyond repair. That night she entered the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. The fire glowed low in the hearth, and the room smelled of ash and salt. She took down a small clay jar from the highest shelf, the one wrapped in cloth. Inside was a fine, pale powder ground from the roots of the oleander she'd been cultivating in secret for years. She added only a pinch to the coffee pot that would be served to Briggs in the morning. Just a pinch, enough to cause chest pains, trembling, confusion, not death, not yet. When dawn broke, the overseer swaggered into the kitchen like he always did, barking orders and demanding his coffee. Hannah poured it for him, eyes down, voice steady. He didn't even look at her. He never did. By noon, he was on the ground outside the stables, gasping for breath as the other slaves pretended not to see. The doctor called it heat stroke. Hannah knew better. She had tested the dosage perfectly. The poison would leave his body weak, his mind fogged, his authority shattered. For the first time in her life, Hannah watched a white man tremble under her power. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. It wasn't about joy, it was about balance. But something else happened that day. One of the field hands, a quiet man named Josiah, saw her watching Briggs fall. He saw the stillness in her eyes. Later, as they hauled the overseer's body inside, Josiah whispered, "You did that, didn't you?" Hannah froze. For a heartbeat, everything around her stopped. Then she turned slowly, met his gaze, and said softly, "If I did, then keep it buried or you'll be next." But Josiah didn't speak again. Instead, over the next weeks, whispers began spreading among the slaves. Stories about a woman who could kill without a blade, a woman the spirits themselves protected, a woman who could make white men bleed without ever touching them. The myth of Hannah the poisoner was born long before her first victim actually died. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that myths, once released, take on lives of their own, and myths are far harder to control than poison. Charleston, 1008, 147, a city dressed in beauty but built on bones. The cobblestone streets shimmered after rain, the gas lamps flickered like watchful eyes, and behind every curtain, someone was hiding something. But now something else moved beneath it all, a rumor, spreading from mouth to mouth, house to house. They said a slave woman had cursed her master's land, that her hands could turn food to death, that she spoke to unseen forces who answered her with vengeance. At first, no one took it seriously. The masters laughed. The priests denounced it as African superstition. But the laughter didn't last, because one by one, strange things began to happen. A plantation owner in Dorchester County fell dead at his desk, his face twisted in pain, no wound, no mark. A merchant's wife miscarried after eating a single slice of sweetbread. A judge who'd sentenced 3 runaway slaves was found blind, screaming of burning light. All within 30 miles of the Whitmore plantation. The newspapers never printed the connection, but the streets knew. And when fear takes root among the powerful, it corrodes faster than rust. The same men who once bragged about their cruelty began traveling with guards, locking their food in iron chests, refusing to eat anything not cooked by their own hands. Inside the Whitmore kitchen, Hannah said nothing. She moved with the same calm precision she always had, her eyes steady, her hands quiet. But the slaves began to look at her differently, some in awe, some in terror, some in prayer. One night, Josiah approached her behind the smokehouse. "They're saying you're the one who did it," he whispered. "They're saying death follows wherever you go." Hannah met his gaze and said, "Then let it follow the right people." He nodded once, and from that moment, he became her silent ally, the first believer in a movement that didn't yet have a name. But Hannah understood something Josiah didn't. Power attracts attention, and attention brings danger. Somewhere in Charleston, among the white elite, someone was watching. Someone who understood that if one woman could weaponize fear this effectively, she wasn't just a threat to a household, she was a threat to the entire system. That someone was Reverend Silas Wren, a preacher known for his sermons on divine order and obedience. He heard the whispers, followed them, traced them back to the plantations west of Charleston. And one Sunday morning, as Hannah stood in the kitchen, she heard his voice echo from the main hall. "Sin walks among us," he thundered, "and it wears the face of those who pretend to serve." Her blood went cold. He didn't know her name, not yet, but his words told her he was coming. And when the church comes for a woman like Hannah, it never comes to forgive. The Reverend arrived unannounced. His carriage rolled through the iron gates of the Whitmore plantation just after dawn, drawn by 2 black horses with eyes like wet coal. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as the wheels cut through the red clay, the sound hollow and final like a shovel striking a coffin lid. Reverend Silas Wren was not a man you forgot. Tall, pale, with a thin mouth that never smiled, he carried an air of righteousness so sharp it could slice through the air. His sermons in Charleston were known to bring men to their knees and women to tears. He preached of purity, of order, of divine punishment for those who defied the natural hierarchy. When he stepped into the Whitmore home, silence followed him like a shadow. "Brother Whitmore," he said softly, "your house reeks of sin." Hannah kept her head down as she served the coffee, but she felt his eyes on her, slow, searching, deliberate, the way a hawk studies a mouse before the strike. Within hours, Reverend Wren began his investigation. He questioned the slaves one by one, asking about charms, herbs, whispers of witchcraft. To the masters, it was entertainment, a holy man chasing ghost stories. But to the slaves, it was a trap, because a wrong word meant the whip, or worse. When it was Hannah's turn, she met his questions with silence. He asked if she believed in curses. She said, "Only the ones written by men like you." For a moment, something flickered behind his calm mask. Then he smiled, that cold, knowing smile of men who believe God sits in their pocket. "Pride," he said, "is the first language of the damned." That night he asked to bless the kitchen. Hannah agreed. As he sprinkled holy water and muttered Latin prayers, she stood perfectly still, her eyes never leaving him. When he was done, he turned to her and whispered, "You've touched something unholy. I can smell it." But the Reverend was not the only one who could sense things. Hannah could smell him, too, the faint, metallic scent of guilt that no perfume could mask. Men like Wren preached holiness to hide rot, and she would find out what his rot was. For days he lingered on the plantation, pretending to pray while secretly watching her. He followed her to the herb garden, inspected her jars, questioned the overseer, and made notes in a small black book. But one evening, while the Reverend was in town, Hannah slipped into his guest room. Inside his coat pocket, she found the same small black book. In it, lists, names, payments, women. Reverend Silas Wren was no preacher. He was a collector of secrets of sins of people. The church didn't send him to save souls. It sent him to keep the system intact, and now Hannah held the proof in her hands. For the first time, she realized her war was not just against one family. It was against an empire that called itself holy. The Reverend returned to the Whitmore estate with fire in his eyes and a sermon on his tongue. He had spent the night in Charleston, spreading whispers that the Whitmore plantation was infected by a witch. The word spread like plague smoke through the white township's witch. It was the kind of word that turned ignorance into righteousness and gave cruelty the scent of holiness. When he stepped off his carriage the next morning, Hannah was waiting. Her hands were clean, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. "Child," he said softly, "you mock the Lord with your silence. Confess your sins before they consume your soul." She looked at him with a faint smile, and for the first time she didn't look afraid. "Reverend," she said slowly, "what if I told you the Lord has already confessed to me?" His brow furrowed. Blasphemy. But her voice stayed steady. "He told me about you, about the women who disappear after your blessings, about the gold you hide beneath your church floor." The Reverend froze. His jaw tightened. "You lie." Hannah stepped closer, not a servant now, but something else. "God doesn't lie, Reverend, you said so yourself." That night, the Reverend dreamt of her voice. It wound through his prayers like a serpent's hiss, coiling around his faith until every verse he spoke began to sound like a curse. When he woke, his black book was gone. By morning, every slave on the plantation knew what was inside it. Every secret, every transaction, every name, the overseer's crimes, the mistress's affairs, the Reverend's sins. Hannah had copied them all, and the paper passed from hand to trembling hand like sacred scripture. By sundown, even the Whitmores looked uneasy. The Reverend's sermons now fell on deaf ears. His holy words were ashes in the air. That's when Hannah began to preach. She stood in the clearing near the workers' quarters, lit by the glow of the forge. The fire painted her face in gold and shadow. "They call us cursed," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "But the only curse on this land is their hunger for power. They build their heaven on our backs and call it divine order. But listen to me, the earth has memory. The blood we've spilled here doesn't die. It waits." The crowd was silent, not out of fear, but awakening. Her words moved through them like thunder rumbling beneath the soil. "Tonight," she whispered, "the Lord they pray to will hear us instead." That night, when the Reverend tried to leave, his carriage would not start. The horses thrashed, their eyes wide with panic. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of burning herbs. And from the darkness, the slaves began to hum an old, forbidden tune that rose from their ancestors' graves. Reverend Silas Wren stumbled from his seat, clutching his cross. But the cross felt heavier than before, as if the sins it had witnessed had finally found weight. From the shadows, Hannah stepped forward, holding a lantern. The flame inside burned steady and bright, unflinching. "You taught us the language of your God," she said softly. "Now listen as we speak it back to you." The night cracked open like old wood under weight. Thunder rolled low, dragging across the Louisiana horizon as if the heavens themselves were moving closer to watch. The Whitmore plantation slept uneasy. Lamps burned in windows, dogs barked without reason, and the air tasted metallic, like the moment before lightning strikes. Inside the manor, Master Whitmore sat alone in his study. His hands trembled as he poured whiskey into a glass already full. The ledger lay open before him, a book filled with numbers, names, and the weight of a century's sins. Hannah's words haunted him. "The earth has memory." He turned the page and froze. The ink on the ledger was running. The words blurred as if melting off the paper, letters sinking like blood into the grain. His pulse spiked. He blinked hard and realized it wasn't the ink. It was water. The ceiling above him was dripping, though the storm hadn't broken yet. A single droplet fell onto his hand, black, thick, warm. Not water, not rain. Downstairs, the Reverend knelt in prayer. His voice quivered as he begged for deliverance. But no words came out anymore, only air, ragged and hollow. The cross around his neck had turned cold as iron. And outside, in the clearing where Hannah once prayed for mercy, the air shimmered with movement. The slaves stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, faces illuminated by the orange glow of torches. Hannah stood in the center, her white dress stained with earth, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "This land remembers," she said softly, "every scream, every lash, every stolen life. It was built on blood, and tonight it will taste it back." From the tree line came a sound slow at first, like wind moving through tall grass. Then louder, chains, hundreds of them, rattling in rhythm. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Whitmore stumbled outside, shouting for his men, his voice drowned by the storm breaking overhead. Rain fell in sheets, but it wasn't enough to wash away what had risen. The soil split, black mud bubbling like something breathing beneath it. The Reverend ran toward Hannah, clutching his cross like a weapon. "You'll burn in hell," he screamed. She turned to him, calm, almost kind. "Hell," she whispered, "we've been living in it." Lightning split the sky. For a single instant, everyone saw them, the silhouettes of the lost, dozens of them, the men and women whose names were never written, standing shoulder to shoulder behind Hannah. Their faces were pale as smoke, their eyes glowing faintly in the storm. When the light faded, the Reverend was gone. Only his cross remained half buried in the mud. The storm lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Whitmore house stood in silence. Its walls were scorched, its fields drowned. The name Whitmore never appeared again in any parish record after that night. The land was abandoned, swallowed by the river over time, but in the nearby town, people still whisper. They say when the rain comes heavy, you can hear hymns rising from beneath the ground, not of praise, but of remembrance, a warning in the wind. And some nights, when the moon is thin and red, a lone figure walks the edge of the river, a woman with a lantern, whispering the same words again and again.